Hi, I'm Brian with BibleStudying.net, and we're going to continue talking about epistemology. In the last segment, we talked about some definitions for the objective and subjective approaches to knowledge, and we looked at some other definitions for things like science, empiricism, and reason. And by those definitions, we showed that there is an association between science, empiricism, and reason with the objective approach to knowledge, and rightly so. We also defined the subjective approach in terms of a view of knowledge where truth and reality exists in the mind, it's conceived of in the mind, distinct from reality outside the mind, and also that it's a view of knowledge where even the knowledge and reality is perceived in the mind is unaffected by the external world. And now I want to take the subjective approach and do the same thing we did with the objective, and that is to show some things that are associated with it by definition. And primarily I want to focus on the concept of mysticism and how that's related to the subjective approach to knowledge. According to Microsoft Encarta, what is mysticism? It is an immediate, direct, intuitive knowledge of God or ultimate reality. Notice that immediate is opposed to things outside of you that you observe. It's immediate, it's direct in the sense that you don't have to use reason to get to it. You have it immediately, directly, and it's intuitive because you're not using reason as well. So this immediate, direct, intuitive is contrasted with things outside of you that are indirectly related to you that you have to go and apply reason to. So there's a strong contrast between mysticism and the objective view of knowledge and empiricism and science. It goes on here to describe how in mysticism the apparent separateness and individuality of beings and events are held to be an illusion. And you see this in Gnosticism, which is a phenomenon of the 1st and 2nd century that Christians are dealing with as a heresy. You see it in some views of Platonism, some forms of Eastern religion. The idea is that the things that you see around you that appear to be distinct, the person you live next door is distinct from you, their house, the car, the tree, the sky, the land, all of these things appear to be distinct objects to us. But in reality, according to the subjective approach, that distinctness is an illusion. And so there is this idea that external reality with its separate things, separate objects, is merely an illusion. And because external reality becomes an illusion, there becomes an emphasis on ultimate knowledge and ultimate reality being something that's perceivable only in the mind, not in that illusionary world around us. Confirming this, Merriam-Webster's Collegiate Dictionary defines mysticism as belief that direct knowledge of God, spiritual truth, or ultimate reality can be attained through subjective experience, such as intuition or insight. And so what we're going to do in this video to some extent is contrast the objective to the subjective in a various number of ways. And the first one we want to do is contrast it in the area of their common associations. I want to pull up a couple graphics here. And the first one, we're sort of draw a line down the middle, and we're going to put objective on one side and subjective on the other. And under the objective side, you're going to put science, reason, and evidence. And under the subjective side, you're going to put mysticism, religion, and faith. Now, I think that this is a very simple way of looking at things, and I think, unfortunately, it is the most common way that people associate these various topics and concepts. Science versus mysticism, reason versus religion, and evidence versus faith. That's the way most people look at it. Unfortunately, I think this is highly inaccurate, not just from within the Christian biblical point of view, but just generally speaking, and historically speaking concerning various types of religions, because not all religions have the same epistemology, not all religions have the same historic and philosophical underpinning. And so the more accurate graphic that we're going to be showing now is going to, again, draw a line down the middle. It's going to have objective on one side and subjective on the other. Under objective, it's going to have science, and it's going to contrast that with mysticism. Science is objective versus mysticism, which is subjective. Reason and evidence, which are objective, versus meditative realization and intuition, which are subjective. Judeo-Christian faith, which is objective, versus blind faith, which is subjective. Historic Judeo-Christian religion, which is objective, versus mystical religions, such as Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, Platonism, Shinto, Sikhism, Baha'i, New Age, and ultimately also Islam. But that's the subject of another study. As well as syncretistic forms of Judeo-Christianity, such as Kabbalism and Gnosticism. Those are on the subjective side. And because they're syncretized, they're blended with mystical religions. But they're contrasted with historical Judeo-Christianity, which we will see has always been objective in its approach to knowledge. On the objective side, we also have reasonable certainty, versus on the subjective side, uncertainty and being extremely skeptical about certainty and knowledge. On the objective side, we're going to have hermeneutics, and on the subjective side, it's going to be contrasted with deconstruction. So hermeneutics versus deconstruction, we'll talk about what those terms mean as we go. But Judeo-Christianity is not a worldview based upon the acquisition of knowledge through subjective or mystical insight. It is not a worldview that is going to reject reason and evidence as the basis of knowledge. In fact, those are going to be the two things in Judeo-Christianity that are the basis of knowledge, evidence and reason. And we'll see Scripture demonstrating that over and over again. And Judeo-Christianity is not a worldview that makes assumptions, then afterwards tries to dress up those assumptions in a facade of reason and evidence after the fact. And that's often how you see it presented, that when you have Christians who are creationists debating evolutionists, the evolutionists will say, oh, you're trying to make it look like this is based on science and evidence and reason and evidence, but that's just after the fact. You've already just pretty much started off with your assumption about God. And so that's the perception that's out there, but that's not the truth of Christianity. That's not the truth of how Christianity approaches faith or approaches knowledge or understanding. From the very beginning in its history, as well as recorded in sacred writings, Judeo-Christianity is a religion where knowledge is based upon evidence and reason. Now that evidence can come in various forms. It can come in the form of the natural world around us, as Paul appeals to in Romans chapter 1, where he says that from the creation of the world, the invisible things about God, including morality and his judgments, are clearly seen and made visible by those things which were made around us and are visible to us. It also can come in the form of supernatural works, miracles demonstrating that a particular concept is backed by God, is what God's message truly is. It can come in the form of prophets who, although they may initially receive something subjectively, they make a prediction, that prediction comes to pass and everyone can objectively see it, and so that becomes evidence that what they said was true, and that of course is just a subcategory of supernatural works. And it can also come in the form of the historical evidence itself. In other words, we have historical writings down through time that describe for us what happened here or there, which century, and which continent, which group of people or culture, and those records become the piece of evidence that we use to understand things about history at various points. And the New Testament and the Old Testament are themselves in that same category of written historical records that we can look to as evidence to deduce the truth. And so there's various ways in which the New Testament and the Old Testament, biblical Christianity, biblical Judeo-Christian worldview, appeals to evidence first and the application of reason to it in order to understand the things about God and theology and morality, etc., etc. There's various categories, but always putting it in the realm of the objective, with evidence and reason being the basis of knowledge. So actually we're going to run a little close here on time, so I want to stop for a second so that we can get into some proofs of that in the next video and really take our time with the biblical proofs for the objective approach to knowledge. And so I'll stop there and we'll come back in just a second.